welcome to Amrita by the Book. My name is Amrita. This is my booktube, and today I am delighted to be taking part in the virtual Jane Con for the first time. Dedicated Jane Austen fans will know that this event has been organized by the wonderful Bianca Hernandez Knight, whom some of you might know as at Book Holding on Twitter and elsewhere. For 2 days, that is the 1st and 2nd of May, people from all around the world are going to be posting videos and hosting panels about Jane Austen right here on YouTube. And this particular video is going to be about cinematic adaptations of Jane Austen. Basically, I wanted to talk about how Jane Austen, who is a very, very British writer, is perceived in the language of cinema around the world, particularly by people who were once part of the British Empire. Now, obviously, that's a giant ask, and I don't want to sit here the whole day or make you do the same. So this video is really about a selection of movies that I think are interesting and have something to say culturally. We're going to be looking at movies from the United States, from Canada, from Britain itself, and from India. I chose these countries because I am most familiar with their cultures, and I didn't want to take space away from people from other cultures who might have their own interactions with Austen. So if you're from one of these cultures, or if you're from another culture that has a significant relationship with Austen, I would love to hear from you in the comments below, or if you would like to make your own video. So I'd like to begin by talking about Austen's Britishness. As somebody who was writing contemporaneously in the early 19th century, Austen is really misunderstood these days as a romance writer when what she was actually doing was social criticism. I've said this before in my video about Mansfield Park, and I'll repeat it again for those of you who haven't watched it. Austen writes about class, she writes about individualism, she talks about the state of England at a very turbulent stage of its history. She has a lot to say about gender roles, about inheritances, about class, and she explores each of them in the context of her own culture. Hers is not a global lens, it's a very British, very English lens. And the narrowness of that gaze is something that has been celebrated and misinterpreted and also derided. So on the one hand, you have people like the alt-right in the United States who celebrate her as the pinnacle or the epitome of white culture. And in fact, you don't even need to be a part of the alt-right, in my opinion. I feel like there is a very vocal set of Austen fans, on the internet at least, who really drill down into her whiteness and celebrate it in a way that excludes Austen fans from elsewhere. Which is one of the reasons why I chose this topic and why I wanted to make this video, because there is a universality in the very specific nature of her writing that I think bears repeating often and as loudly as possible. In fact, that universality is something that I think has actually inhibited a lot of cinema cultures from around the world from really interrogating her Britishness. Because you have to remember, Austen was very much a writer of her time, and her time was when Britain was capitalizing on its empire. And I don't think people from the former colonies have really engaged with that aspect of her work and of her as a writer in cinematic form. I feel it has been a lot more easier for people to engage with specific parts of her writing that resonate most closely with their own. And I feel in places like India and in places that still have a significant relationship with England or with Britain, they're still trying to locate themselves within this consciously constructed sphere of culture that was promoted to us as the epitome of everything that is superior. And so for a lot of people from the former colonies, When we talk about Austen and we are talking about her writing, we're talking about the world that she built in her novels, we're still talking about something that is superior. And the thing about something that we see as superior is that we automatically are conditioned to inspect and interrogate it less. I see this as a problem as a Jane Austen fan because I think her novels are complex and are especially interesting to deconstruct and to contextualize. And I would like to see more of that. But we'll come to that in a minute. Now, before I begin, I do want to point out that there is one very significant movie that is missing from my list of adaptations, and that is the Sense and Sensibility that was written by Emma Thompson and directed by Ang Lee. I did consider putting it in here because Lee is Taiwanese, and I definitely think he brought something to the sensibility of that movie, pun not intended. But I still think of that as a very British movie because it was penned by Emma Thompson. That said, let's begin with a couple of British movies that I think are really complex. I'm going to start with my least favorite movie out of all the movies that we're going to be talking about today, and that is Gurinder Chadha's Bride and Prejudice, starring Aishwarya Rai and Martin Henderson. I've gone on record before about how much I loathe Martin Henderson as Mr. Darcy in this adaptation and about how little he seemed to want to be there. The two of them have zero chemistry whatsoever. And literally the only people that I've ever seen like this movie are people who've never seen a Bollywood movie before and are just dazzled by, the Bollywood language that this movie adopts from the Mumbai film industry. That said, this movie is incredibly interesting to me because Gurinder Chadha is a British Asian director who, before Pride and Prejudice, had made some of the most interesting British Asian films that I've ever seen. She has this ability to really drill down into the interior lives of British Asian women across generations and talk about their anxieties. And those are the skills that she actually brings to this film. It's just that it's in the background. Around the time that this movie came out, India was very much in the nascent stages of its liberalization process, and therefore we were kind of seeing a shift into how India used to be versus where India was headed. And it became clear at some point that the axis had tilted towards the United States rather than towards the UK. And so what Chadha did is that she chose to make Mr. Darcy an American. And so all of a sudden you have this Indian family that is sort of balanced between the Mr. Bingham character, who's a British Asian, and the Darcy character, who's an American. And you get to see all the anxieties of not just class and economic structures, but also about culture. In the original Pride and Prejudice, both Elizabeth and Jane are somewhat embarrassed. By somewhat, I mean sometimes acutely embarrassed by their family. And in this particular version, they're actually embarrassed by how their family chooses to assert their cultural identity in a mixed culture scenario. And while we're supposed to sympathize with the Elizabeth and Jane characters, I actually think it's a lot more forward and modern if you look at how the Bennet family in this particular version are so unapologetic about their Indian roots. Obviously, the ways that the younger sisters choose to present themselves and their Indian identity are kind of cringe and still hilarious. But there's a lot to be said about how Elizabeth and Jane react to the family outing themselves, so to speak, as, really Indian. My other British pick is Mansfield Park by Patricia Rozema, and I have gone on record saying that this is possibly one of my all-time favorite adaptations of Austen because it really engages with the darker side of the upper class lifestyle. Rosemma is Canadian, and I find it interesting that she is, till date, as far as I'm aware, one of the only few people who have actually engaged with, things like slavery that happened very much in the background of the Austen novels. This movie came out in the late 90s, and I find it fascinating that in the 20 years since, and in spite of this particular version being really well received, we still haven't seen that many adaptations engage with things like that. In this particular version, Rosemma makes a decision to take the pristine, pious version of England and not only show you the class differentiations between the upper classes and the lower classes, but also portray the hollowness of the morality and the muck in which the foundations of this wonderful England are laid. The father as we see him in the manor versus the father that Tom remembers in the plantations. I mean, it's like night and day. Tom's malady is physical, but it is a manifestation of the psychological shock that he received when he actually confronted the truth of his family's wealth and privilege. However, I do have an entire video about this. I'm just going to link to that up above. And I'm going to move on. Now, it's really interesting to me when I'm thinking about American adaptations of Austen because it kind of moves a little bit into fetishization. It's incredible to me the number of movies that have come out about Austen herself rather than, just her books. I like to look at the 1940 version of Pride and Prejudice because I think it was one of the first adaptations of a book that I saw on screen that really made me question what constitutes an adaptation, because loose doesn't even cut it. One of the things that I really enjoy about old school Hollywood is its ability to just adapt whatever it felt could be adapted and in whatever manner it saw fit. The 40s version is no different. The costumes were insane. When Bridgerton came out and people were talking about how the costumes weren't that perfect, I remember laughing because you should take a look at the costumes in this particular version of Pride and Prejudice. They're basically all dressed for Gone with the Wind, except, they're making Pride and Prejudice. And I kind of love that about it, because to me, it is a testament to Hollywood. I mean, this is an industry that was still in its infancy at the time, and they were innovating. There were no rules, there were no, critics out there to tell them like this is fine and that isn't. All they had was the government to tell them no kissing. To me, this movie really speaks to the can-do attitude of those early Hollywood pioneers and their talent for understanding the mechanics of what would draw audience interest. People wanted to see Laurence Olivier get his butt handed to him by Greer Garson, and that's what they got. This is an industry that really understood and capitalized on star power, and you can see it in full form in this particular film. Is it one of the best Pride and Prejudice adaptations? No. Is it enjoyable? Yes. Also enjoyable is another version of Pride and Prejudice called Pride and Prejudice Atlanta that came out fairly recently. Now, this is a made-for-TV movie, and I think it is amazing because it takes this very white, very British story and then transports it to Atlanta and plays out in a very black culture and community. I don't really understand why we don't talk about this particular adaptation as much as all the other adaptations, because it is A, really good. B, it also shows, like how something that was written 200 years ago is still relevant in terms of gender roles, patriarchy, community, class. The relationship between this particular version of Elizabeth and Darcy feels perfectly on key because it really understands how class plays into this community. Again, this is a more loose adaptation. I feel like there are more loose adaptations of Pride and Prejudice than any other Jane Austen novel, which is really a testament to the relationship that she was able to bring about between the two characters. But in this particular one, they do a really good job with class and appearances, which is essential to the original novel. And if you're going to be talking about appearances, then of course we have to talk about Clueless. Now, what can I tell you about Clueless that you don't already know? This is a cult classic. Everybody's seen it. Everybody has opinions about it. Everybody's spoken about it. But what I really find interesting about this particular version of Emma is how seamlessly the dynamics transfer to a high school. An American high school in the mid-1990s is about as far away as you can get from the setting of the original Emma. And yet you can see the cliques, you can see the anxieties about fitting in, who is considered lame, who is considered in, who's a potential date and who isn't. And again, how class and privilege play into all of this. This is what I mean when I say that there are things about the original Austen works that, despite its very specific context, still make so much sense anywhere you go, because these are very human interactions and contexts. But talking about Clueless leads me to the next film on my list, which comes all the way from India, and it's called Aisha. Aisha is again an adaptation of Emma, but in this particular one, I think is super interesting because it's set in Delhi high society. Now, within India, Delhi high society and Delhi in general are often the butt of jokes and much derision because it can be incredibly pretentious and ostentatious. And Aisha, who is the Emma character, is all of those things. She's the much indulged daughter of a very wealthy man, and she behaves like it. To me, this particular adaptation is of interest, A, because it provides a snapshot of a city at a very specific point in its history. I'm not saying that the Delhi that is shown in this film doesn't exist anymore. I'm saying that it's mutated to another version by now. But the dynamics that the characters share in this film, I mean, it allies so closely to the anxieties that the original characters in the novel went through. It's this incredible, delicate dance about who is good enough to do what? What constitutes good behavior? Who does society punish? And is that correct on a moral basis? In my opinion, Aisha really nails that intricate dance between wealth and class and privilege, as well as aspiration and hypocrisy. It's actually one of the more complex portrayals of these issues that I've seen in an Indian film, in an Indian mainstream film. And I think more people should watch it. And that brings me to Kandu Konde, which is by far one of my most favorite Jane Austen adaptations. This Tamil language film starring Tabu and Aishwarya Rai in the lead character roles is an adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, and what I really enjoy about this film is that it takes the sentiments of the original novel and does an excellent job of integrating it into the local culture. The journey of the two sisters is not merely about their relationships with men, but also the cultural practices that in many ways mirror the original situations in the Austen novel. I began this video by telling you that when I first watched the 1940s Pride and Prejudice film, I wondered what constituted a successful adaptation. Was it the language? Was it the character arc? Was it just the plot? And when I watched Kandu Konde, I thought a successful adaptation is something that is able to understand the emotional truth of the characters and portray that. The plot is of course important as long as you leave space for the characters to interact with their surroundings and their settings and each other in the same honest manner that they were able to do in the original version. And I think Kandu Kondain does that. By taking what was a very British Regency novel and making it an incredibly Tamil film, we can see the universality of the themes, see how little things have changed in 200 years, very sadly enough. Because in the end, when Austen was writing her novels and she was criticizing certain parts of society, I can only imagine that she was hoping for something better. And the sad part is, a lot of things didn't get better. In the original novel, the sisters are young women from good families, and as such, they have no recourse except to marry well. In this movie, made a good 200 years later, the young women go out and find jobs and try to support themselves and their mother, but at the end of the day, they too need to think about getting married, which makes you wonder, what was the point? So that's my video for the virtual Jane Con event. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video and Jane Austen, don't forget to surf the hashtag link down below. People from around the world will be posting videos about Jane Austen right here on YouTube today and tomorrow. Once again, thank you for watching, and until next time, happy reading. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.